For the first time in nearly 3 years of war between Russia and Ukraine, it appears that senior leaders are finally getting the message, and that reality is somehow breaking through, and they recognize that the war cannot be won and that a negotiated settlement is now on the table. We had actually just today, the prime minister from Poland, Tusk, has said, you know what, the negotiations could start as early as this winter, which basically means when Donald Trump comes into office. And that's a pretty big shift by itself, because Poland has been one of the more outspoken, anti any kind of negotiations with Ukraine and Russia. They've been wanting to pour more weapons in. There was some talk for a long period of time about possibly putting Polish soldiers into Western Ukraine, etc. Now then, what's changed, of course, is Donald Trump has come in, and as he's been saying both in Paris and in every other venue since he's been elected, that the war is coming to an end. And now, finally, belatedly, people are starting to line up behind that reality. And to help us unpack some of this and find out maybe why this shift is taking place, we have Colonel Doug Macgregor, decorated combat veteran, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. Doug, as always, great to have you back on the show.
Well, thanks, Dan.
Well, listen, we'll just start right off with that first bit there from Poland. Does it surprise you any that it's happened, or that it's taken this long, or how do you view the comment from Tusk earlier today?
Well, I don't know about Donald Tusk. I've seen him on more than one occasion say things that he subsequently recanted. But I do think that there is a growing awareness among the elites, certainly, and increasingly in the electorates of Western Europe and Central East Europe, that this is a lost war, a lost cause. I don't think anybody disputes that. I don't know about these calls for ceasefires and these kinds of things, because, again, we haven't heard any framework. And the framework is very, very important. And whatever we want or what we think cannot be treated in isolation from the rest of the region.
Probably what spawned all this, specifically to talk about a ceasefire, though Trump did talk about a little bit during the campaign. It kind of had been quiet, really, as he's been focused on getting his transition team in order. But a couple of days ago, he was in Paris and met with Macron and Zelensky, and they were, of course, talking about the opening of the Notre Dame Cathedral. But behind the scenes, it was pretty clear that they're talking about what's next. And following this meeting, Trump actually was interviewed on American TV, saying that he's looking for an immediate ceasefire. And when asked what he meant by that, and is the money going to dry up, he had this to say.
Should Ukraine prepare for less aid from the United States after you're sworn into office?
Yeah, probably. Sure.
You said you can end the war in 24 hours. You've even said you want to try to end it before you're sworn into office. You're actively trying to?
I am.
Have you talked to President Putin?
No, I have not.
You haven't talked to President Putin
No, I have
since
not.
you've been elected?
No. Well, I don't want to say that, but I haven't spoken to him recently.
So you've spoken to President Putin since you've been elected?
I don't want to say that. I don't want to say anything about that, because I don't want to do anything that could impede the negotiation.
Now, I've heard from a number of sources, even before this admission, that the Trump team or the Trump himself had been involved in coordination with the Russian side. What do you think is the message coming from the Russian side about what they will or won't do?
I think everyone should go back and listen to the most recent comments by the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. And then I would go back and listen to what President Putin has had to say in the past. He's always said that he's open to negotiations and willing to talk. But I think people need to understand something, and that's not very clear that President Trump understands this. He's dealing with these phony statistics about the losses the Russians have taken, which are actually quite modest. The exchange rate between the Russians and Ukrainians is somewhere around 1 Russian for every 6 or 7 Ukrainians. And certainly in the last few months, it's been even higher as the Ukrainians have begun to collapse militarily on the battlefield. That's when armies in retreat or withdrawal take huge casualties, and that's been the case. Thousands of people being killed every week pointlessly because no one is willing to stand up and say what Donald Trump, I think, was trying to urge Zelensky to say, which is it's over. We need a halt to this. But the problem is that simply saying you want a halt to this isn't likely to have much impact on the Russians, because they will not accept any outcome of any negotiation that does not provide for neutrality for whatever remains of the Ukrainian state. That's been said repeatedly. They're very serious about it. And anyone who thinks they're going to negotiate with the Russians over what the land will look like in the future and who is going to govern inside Ukraine had better accept that proposition right up front. And I'm not sure that the Russians have heard that.
Yeah, and in case anybody on the U.S./Western side hadn't, Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, I believe it was just day before yesterday, reemphasized that the entry level for negotiations are all four of the oblasts that they negotiated or annexed rather in 2022. And of course, Ukraine still has troops on some of that territory. The Russians haven't gained all that back. So they say it has to start with all of that, and then Ukraine has to withdraw out of it. And of course, the declaration for no NATO. And if they're not even willing to talk about those two, then it seems that they're ready to go on. And to your point, here's actually what Lavrov did say just a couple of days ago.
Had the coup in February 2014, had it not happened, and had the deal which was reached the day before between the then president and the opposition implemented, Ukraine would have stayed one piece by now with Crimea in it. It's absolutely clear. They did not deliver on the deal, instead they staged the coup. The deal, by the way, provided for creation of a government of national unity in February 2014 and holding early elections, which the then president would have lost. Everybody knew that. But they were impatient, and they took the government buildings next morning. They went to this Maidan Square and announced that they created the government of the winners.
So I felt that was more important than some people may realize, because he was saying that Russia was willing to abide by that deal that was in, I think it was in January of 2014, that said February 2014, that early elections were going to be held, that their guy, Yanukovych, was going to lose probably, but then that there would be a national unity government. And he's claiming that they were willing to let Ukraine be a unitary state, even with Crimea in it, but because we didn't accept that deal, and then they tried to seize power by force, then he says that's when they made the decision to go to Ukraine. So in this case, do you think that Russia is willing to say, we're willing to negotiate a good deal, but it's got to be these minimum, and if it's not, we'll keep going again like we did with Crimea?
No, I think so. In fact, and I don't know what the Russian general staff is saying. I don't know what General Gerasimov has recommended, but I suspect that there are many, many people on the Russian general staff who are making it very clear that by 20 January, Russian forces should be standing all along the river line of the Dnieper River. And I think that's where they're headed. That's where they want to be. That doesn't mean they intend to hold on to all of it or will claim all of it. It all depends on what the discussions turn out to be. The other thing is that if we think we are going to dictate to the Russians anything, we're very much mistaken. We're not. That's not how this is going to work. The other thing is, for any agreement to be reached, as a minimum, the states that border Russia and Ukraine will have to be part of that agreement. Obviously, that's not just Poland. That's Slovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and probably Romania or Moldova, and Hungary to some extent. In other words, we simply show up and say we want a ceasefire, and this is the way we see things in the future, is not going to go anywhere with Moscow. And I think we need to understand that. And recounting these false narratives, oh, the Russians are weak, the Russians have no choice, the Russians can't do this or that, they've taken all these horrendous casualties, all nonsense. It's not going to get you anywhere. I mean, you can preach that nonsense in the West to your heart's content if it makes you feel good. But the reality on the battlefield is very different. And that's what will ultimately decide the outcome. I think that's what President Orban in Hungary has tried to make clear. And I think there are some others. I don't know about the gentleman in Slovakia. He may or may not have joined in on that. But the bottom line is, I think most people know this is a situation similar to Napoleon Bonaparte and the Pope. Somebody said to Bonaparte about his intentions to annex something or to move into somewhere, either it was northern Italy or east of the Rhine. And somebody said, well, the Pope will never approve of this. And Bonaparte looked at the man and said, how many battalions has the Pope got? And I think at this point, it's put up or shut up. You know, either we are going to do something more than we say we will do, or we should sit down and have a no preconditions discussion and not turn this into a circus designed for propaganda at home. We do that too much. You know, George Kennan used to say that most of what we did in foreign policy, he thought was really for the folks back home to feel good about themselves and how great America is. You know, forget it. If that's what people think they're going to make out of this whole effort at ending the war on our side is going to fail immediately.
Well, and that's one of my concerns, because we have the designated special envoy for Ukraine, General Kellogg, said on Fox News a week or so ago that he was for Biden's flooding the zone with this last, whatever it was, $6 or $8 billion to get as much stuff in there as he possible, because then Trump could use that as leverage to compel the Russian side to something of our desire and outcome. And one hopes that that's also just for public consumption, that behind the scenes, Trump realizes that that's not going to happen. But that is a concern.
Well, Dan, I share your concern, but I would tell you, having met and talked with at length President Trump on previous occasions, President Trump did not say those things. Whatever General Kellogg says is fine. It's not what President Trump has said. What President Trump says counts. And President Trump often allows people that are working for him to go out and say things that he may or may not agree with, using them essentially as trial balloons. And that may have been what he's allowed General Kellogg to do. So I would not assume anything at this point. I think President Trump is sincere, as he was when he said early on, I want the killing to stop. I think he does. I also do not detect and have never believed there's any hostility in Donald Trump for Russia. None. I don't think he sees the Russians in that purely negative light, the way the neocons want to depict Russia at all. So I think we should just not take any of these extracurricular remarks, is what I would call them, from anybody that is theoretically working on the National Security Council staff or working as a deputy national security advisor or anything else. I would wait for President Trump to speak. And I think
actually, you know, and one of the things he did,
that will make a difference.
One of the things he did say, to your point there, in one of his Truth Social marks, was he said, I know President Putin can work with him. So he clearly does not envision any kind of hostility towards him. Now, that's what's been said publicly. One wonders what has been said privately to Zelensky, because he's the other important element in this. And one of the headlines that came out shortly after Trump has met with Zelensky is he said Zelensky is on board with having a negotiated settlement. But then when the media asked Zelensky what he thought afterwards, he seemed to try and walk that back a little bit by saying that, you know, you can't just come in and saying that the war, quote, cannot be ended with a simple piece of paper and a few signatures. Then he said, to ensure that there are no more Ukrainian losses, we must secure a reliable peace. Turning a blind eye to occupation is not an option. So he said, implying that he is not completely on Trump, because Trump is not, I don't think, saying anything that you're going to get an outcome that you like. But Zelensky seems to not be able to get that. And to underscore that a little bit further, yesterday, he makes these videos nearly every day. Yesterday, he went on his own YouTube account and added this.
Сьогодні було кілька тем. Перше – запрошення в НАТО. Друге – мені подобається позиція Мерца. І це просто правдива, справедлива позиція, що для України несправедливо і неефективно воювати однією рукою. І нам потрібні Тауруси, як і інші далекобійні ракети, щоб бити по необхідних військових, саме військових цілях в Росії, і саме так закінчити війну якнайшвидше. чим менше буде російський військовий потенціал, тим швидше буде досягнутий мир.
Gracious, Doug. I mean, this is as far detached from reality as I thought it was too far. I thought it was too
Well,
much.
so I'm sorry, Dan. I wasn't able to see the translation. I got a few
Oh,
words.
okay. Goodness, I'm sorry.
But if you give me the gist of it, I'd appreciate it.
Bottom line is he said that, first of all, he still wants to talk about NATO membership. This is, again, after Trump has already told him what he's going to do, that he appreciates the German candidate Marz, who said he would give an ultimatum to Trump. So he says, yes, we want long-range missiles to weaken Russia so that they can not negotiate from a position of strength, and then we'll be able to get a just peace. That's where he's saying yesterday.
Yeah. Well, I think we have a shot at peace. His notion of justice may not be the same as the Russian notion of justice. And from President Trump's standpoint, I think what he wants more than anything else is some measure of stability and order in the region so that we can get back to doing business. I wouldn't attach very much significance at this stage to anything Zelensky says. He's the leader of a lost cause. I mean, you might as well just tell him to stay out of the room, and the adults in the room will sort this out, whether he likes it or not. And I can tell you, though, we never hear this on the mainstream media in the United States, but the people in Ukraine are sick of this war. They're exhausted. And they will absolutely support the end of the war, even if they don't like the outcome. And I know Ukrainians, and they're very stubborn people, but they're not fools. And what the Russians currently hold is, as a minimum, is Russian. And they know that. And they know that they've mistreated and oppressed the Russians in the past. And this is not going to be tolerated in the future. So I don't think Zelensky has much to say, frankly. He can talk all he likes, but I don't think it's going to make a difference to the ultimate outcome.
Well, and especially in that soundbite we played at the top of the show where Trump was point blank asked, will the support continue on or will it go down? And he said, yeah, it's going to go down for sure. That should signal to Zelensky he's not going to get all this stuff he's been asked for. But to your point that you raised a little bit earlier, what does matter is what's the ground truth on the battlefield. What is that? And that matters. And there has been just a couple of recent reports here in just the last week or so that give a really powerful snapshot of what it is, no matter what anybody wants. And that is the Wall Street Journal, for example, said that in the last 3 months, 6,000 projectiles have been fired from Ukraine, from Russia into Ukraine. And that's talking about drones, missiles, FAB bombs, and the like. 6,000. And that is 3 times higher than the number fired in the previous 3 months, 3 times higher than just the previous 3 months, and 4 times higher than the same number of months in 2023. At the same time, we also saw that the territory that's been gained by Russia continues to pick up speed. And by the way, in the center of the screen, you see, you may not be able to see the numbers where you are. There was 50 square kilometers had been captured by Russia in June. And then every month thereafter, it continues to substantially go up to the last month is in November, 702 square kilometers of additional territory, which is 4.7 times more than Russia gained in the entire calendar year of 2023. And you see the pace is continuing to go up. Then you add on top of that the 100,000 desertions on the Ukraine side, the difficulty they're having manning, just even bringing more people in. And you just see everywhere you look, there is no basis for anyone to even have fantasies like Zelensky is having here, or any in the West for that matter. How do you account for such a dramatic contradiction between what is physically evident and the words coming out of so many people's mouths?
Well, first, let's keep in mind that we're talking about an area that is roughly the size of the United States on the east side of the Mississippi. Or you're talking about armies marching across all the southern states and all the way up to Ohio and Kentucky and eventually up into Pennsylvania. This is an enormous area. And there are pockets of Ukrainians fighting in some of these woods. It's not meaningful, and they will be rooted out and killed and destroyed eventually. But the Russians are very deliberate about this business because, once again, they did not enter this war for the purpose of conquering Ukraine. That was always nonsense. They were never interested, and they're not interested in that now. They certainly do not want to have to govern and administer millions of Ukrainians. That's the last thing they want to do. The only people that they want inside Russia are people that want to be there, and those are primarily Russians. Now that has to be understood. I think the second thing is the contradiction has been there from the first day. All we have to do is roll back to February and March of 2022 and listen to everybody tell us the Ukrainians are winning, the Russians are incompetent, and they can't do anything. The Russians are losing thousands, the Ukrainians aren't taking any casualties. Listen, that was always wrong. It never had any basis in fact. So here we are, almost 3 years later, and we're looking at a humanitarian disaster in Western Ukraine and in much of Eastern Ukraine, a disaster that was never necessary. This is over as far as the Russians are concerned. They're happy to end it, but they're not going to surrender anything unless they get something on the table that guarantees their security. This has always been about their legitimate security interests in Ukraine. Nobody seems to want to mention that. They have legitimate security interests there, have always had them for centuries. They're not going to surrender those. They're happy to let the Ukrainians go off and govern themselves to their heart's content. But there will be no NATO membership under any circumstances. There will be no foreign forces, no foreign bases. If people want to know what President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov are anticipating is something on the model of the Austrian State Treaty. Go back and look at it. That's your model. That will work. And that would be very good for Ukraine, because then the Ukrainians could focus on what really is important, and that is building prosperity and economic strength and triaging this society that's almost completely destroyed.
And there's a lot of people. Zelensky also in the last just few days has continued to resurface these claims by Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron about maybe we'll put Western troops into Western Ukraine as part of a negotiated settlement. But as you say, the Russians aren't going to do this. And here's one other thing that needs to be brought into borne by these people. See, those are the outcomes we want. We want to set the terms on something that we like or that's acceptable to our side. But here's the thing. Russia doesn't have to do any of those things. And let me show you why. This is the map of the current front lines here. And this is some of the southern part near the Pokrovsk area, which is right here. And you see that the Russians are really moving forward in all these different areas. I'm going to show you something from the Military Summary channel this morning that's going to be talking about something that was happening right in this area here where the Russians continue to move up to get closer to Pokrovsk here. But you see that they have been making territory advances in a lot of places. And the Ukraine side is in danger of having a large area cut off here because Russians are making progress up the middle and on the flanks. But watch this clip here from Military Summary channel about what the possibility of coming next right here is.
Other sources are saying that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Shevchenka, and now the Russians have no barriers to move further in the northern direction and to begin the battle for the city of Pokrovsk. So basically, the Ukrainian defense of Pokrovsk collapsed completely. Without showing any resistance. The Ukrainians had enough of time to prepare additional fortifications and strongholds, but now we see that the Ukrainians did nothing during the previous days, and most likely the city of Pokrovsk could fall very, very soon, very, very fast, and this might be the fastest battle ever since the beginning of the special military operation.
That last part there is what got my attention. I mean, we've seen the advances, and when I showed you all that territory that's been gathered and the increasing firepower, none of that's surprising. But that Ukraine has had all this time, when people have known for months that Pokrovsk was the target for all these operations, and yet they still have not been able to, or they have not been willing to make defensive fortifications. So that also could fall pretty quick, which could literally unhinge the entire southern part of the Eastern Front. So when you see that kind of situation on the ground matched with all these other realities we're talking about, how much longer do you think Ukraine can continue to offer resistance?
I think as long as we pump cash into it, assuming that the cash we send, along with the equipment we send, about 50% of it is sold on the black market, or it ends up in the bank accounts of senior Ukrainian officials in the Congress and the government or in the military, I suppose that they'll sacrifice as many Ukrainians as possible as long as the cash shows up and they continue to grow rich. the first time that I think you would see a readiness to call an immediate halt is when the Russians are standing on the Dnieper River and decide to cross it and make a move directly on Kiev. That's the point at which the crooks are running this thing. And they are crooks, Dan. You look at somebody like Zelensky, who was a sort of a cheap comedian, a third-rate actor who's built up into something he never was, and then plays this role of national leader who's not even Ukrainian, for God's sakes. This whole thing is absurd. That is going to go on as long as the cash is there to pay for it, and as long as he has and his friends have security. And a lot of that security is provided by the West, specifically by the British, and to a lesser extent, us. So this sort of comic opera is going to continue unless what I just described happens. It's tragic for the people of Ukraine. They didn't sign up for this. They were not consulted on this. If we go back to the election that Zelensky won, this man from nowhere who was put up as a candidate, he told everyone that he was going to talk to the Russians to put an end to this, that he was going to negotiate with them. There's no reason for any war. And that's one of the reasons he had overwhelming support. People all wanted no war. Well, they still do. Now they've lost most of the manhood of Ukraine in this pointless struggle for nothing. And the people at the top are just gotten richer and richer and richer. These are nothing but criminals. This is an organized crime state. We've got to come to terms with that reality and stop pretending otherwise. And I think President Trump will very quickly come to this conclusion without a whole hell of a lot of help. And I think he may have come to that kind of conclusion with Zelensky for the very reasons that you're telling me. Zelensky is a joke. He's an empty suit. He babbles, and he should be thrown out of the room. And this war should be ended. I think Donald Trump understands that. I think he'll do it, but he can't do it alone. He's got to host a conference that involves the key states that are on Russia's borders. And that includes Germany, by the way. The Germans have to be part of this. They must be part of the end the war caucus, if you will, that includes Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. They've all got to be present. They've all got to sign up for an end to this and for the neutrality of Ukraine. And he can do this. If there's anything we know about Europe, what is it, Dan? There's no one leading anyone in Europe with the possible exception of someone like Orban. The rest of these people are followers. And I guess you have to point to someone like Starmer as an outlier because he thinks he's safe sitting on that island, punishing his own population and hurling rocks at the Russians. I don't think he is, and I think you ought to shut up. But that's his position. He thinks he can do anything. This has got to end. And I think President Trump is the man to do it. But he's got to pursue this differently from what most people have anticipated. This is not an imposition by Washington. He has to be someone who herds the cats into the room and comes up with this agreement based on what he says. And he's got to say, this must be neutral. You know, that is the critical point.
I wish you had been the one that was selected as the envoy, because I'd really like for you to be running that kind of stuff up there. Or at the very least, I hope that someone's paying attention.
Well, remember, President Trump will make the decisions, and stop wasting time listening to others that are on the staff. He will make the statements. He will make the points. And when he does, listen carefully, because I think he is a very reasonable man, and he is a realist. He is not in fantasy. He's not living on Fantasy Island like most of the Hill.
Yeah, I remember that from your time working with him toward the end of his first administration, when you had worked out a plan that met his intent of how to get out of Afghanistan, and then that got subordinated or cut under the knees, cut out from it by others. But don't want to rehash all that right now. I want to shift over in the time we have here to the other major issue that's roiling American national interest and certainly much of the world in the Middle East. So Bashar al-Assad has been driven out of power in what surprised a great many people with how fast it happened, and that it came with very little warning. Just first of all, I just kind of wonder what your observations are and your understanding of why the Assad regime fell so fast now.
Well, there are a lot of people out there telling various stories about it. You've spent time in the Middle East. So have I. You know the lay of the land. You can, as the Israelis have discovered, as we've discovered, buy off large numbers of people if you're smart and you're patient and you know who to talk to. You know, this should not come as a big surprise. So I'm sure that large numbers of officers and probably senior NCOs and soldiers were purchased right there at the beginning or in the months leading up to it. So that's not surprising. Second thing is we've practically destroyed Syria. The only income producing capability on Syrian soil is up in the area that the Kurds control and that we occupy, the oil fields. And that oil has been sold on the black market and spirited down to Israel. And the Kurds have benefited enormously from that because they want to build their own independent state. And that's not lost on anybody that knows the region right now. And that's another issue we should address in the future. So I don't think we should be very surprised by it. In fact, the big income generator, if you will, was drug trafficking in and through Syria, largely championed by the Syrian army, because they just haven't got any cash. They haven't got any money. The place is impoverished. So the fact that it fell apart quickly was not surprising, but it was done in a way that I don't think we, not necessarily us, but certainly not the Russians or the Iranians anticipated. And it was a master stroke. Now we'll talk about this master stroke strategically, what it means for the two principal winners. One is Mr. Netanyahu and the other is Mr. Erdogan, because those are the two standout, beneficiaries of what's now occurred.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about both of those, but before we do, that there's one other entity that wants to set up and say, no, that actually we're the ones who did this. This is a great deal for us. Here's what President Biden said when they asked to explain how all this happened.
For years, the main backers of Assad have been Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia. But over the last week, their support collapsed, all three of them, because all three of them are far weaker today than they were when I took office. Our approach has shifted the balance of power in the Middle East. Through this combination of support for our partners, sanctions, diplomacy, and targeted military force when necessary, we now see new opportunities opening up for the people of Syria and for the entire region.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I see a lot of opportunities for the Syrian people as a result of all of our militant policies over the years here. How do you see that?
Well, no one in Washington cares about the people living in Syria any more than they care about the Ukrainians. Let's be frank. People in Washington and the CIA and at the top of the government, and to a lesser extent, they're big supporters on the Hill and big donors, are engaged in a strategic chess game, and they're very proud of themselves. And they think that they've won in this master stroke. So listen, he's telling you somewhat the truth. But this really began under Obama. Obama was the architect. I don't want to say he was the architect, but this all began under him. And the whole process of repurposing the Al-Qaeda, ISIS terrorists, reforming them, rebranding them, and representing them in a new form that could be useful to the West, to Europe and the United States is what's happened. Now, I think we're going to be surprised about the long-term consequences. Remember, ISIS was also something that was dear and near to the heart of President Erdogan in Turkey until suddenly ISIS began to turn on them and on others in the region. And slowly people saw the wisdom of driving it out. Well, it was never completely exterminated, and it's almost impossible to do that in the Middle East. The Middle East is a place with lots of porous borders, lots of patrons who are willing to support various factions. So you're never going to crush any of these organizations, whether it's ISIS or Hamas or Hezbollah, completely out of existence. But I think what he has said is that the desire is to fundamentally change the Middle East. That has happened. And we need to talk about that because Americans are not in the least interested in most cases. And they are going to watch as this may come back to bite us and everybody else in the future.
Uh, Before we look at the Israel and Turkey specifically, I want to look at the instrument that was used by all those who were supporting him, and that is HTS and Jelani. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you know about him and what you think could happen later. Because just a real brief. In the 2004-5 era, he actually fought against the United States as part of the insurgency in Iraq and was put in jail there for a while, and then later became affiliated with al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate, then later with ISIS, then kind of repudiated them. Now he's saying these days that he's a moderate guy and that he's not going to persecute the Christians or the Druze or any of these other folks. He just wants to govern effectively. First of all, do you think that he has actually changed, and what do you think is going to happen with him going forward?
Well, Dan, I'm not an Arabist, and I don't claim to be an expert on events and peoples in the Middle East. My view of all of this is largely strategic. He's a useful tool right now to us, more specifically to President Erdogan. He was turned, if you will, with what? Cash? Promises of power and influence. I mean, this is a man who led a group of people that just a couple of years ago were selling women on the streets of towns in Syria for $10 a piece. This is someone who has been active in the beheadings, the mass rapes, the mass murder of anybody that he and his band of Islamist thugs didn't care for. These are the people that, you know, most Americans would be repelled by if they looked at it very closely, but they turned out to be useful to us. My point is, I don't think anything's changed in his mind. And I think now he's very focused once again on the things he was focused previously on. And that is going back into Iraq. And we need to understand that. Once they've gained control of most of Syria, then it will be northern Iraq. And they're already moving in those directions. And I think the Iraqis know that. This is a major war developing. Now, how far will he get? Well, he has the backing of Turkish military power. He has the support in terms of close air support of Turkish armed drones. And there are Turkish intelligence officers who are not just helping to guide him and move his forces where they can make great gains in a short period of time. And you know what the desert is like. You can go a long distance very quickly in any number of places. It may or may not mean much. But the point is, this is not a new Renaissance man. These are not diversity sensitive people. That's all nonsense. That's for external consumption. I saw this kind of nonsense go on in the Balkans with the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was nothing more than a Stalinist drug mafia. And that certainly was transformed into Jeffersonian Democrats. You know, we do this all the time. Whoever the enemy is demonized, and whoever is doing our bidding is suddenly a liberal Renaissance character. It's a lot of nonsense. This is all about power, and the power is now split largely between Israel and Turkey.
Okay, yeah, and let's actually look
one camp or another.
Let's look at that then. Now let's go in the Turkish area first. So overnight, I think the Syrian National Army, which is a Turkish-backed group, has taken Manbij and are threatening to take even more territory that is currently, or has been anyway, operated by the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Kurds. How far do you think that the Turks want to go in there, and will the Turkish armed forces themselves actually end up being engaged?
Well, we don't know what was informally agreed to or formally agreed to between Israel and Turkey. We know that the head of Shin Bet just a couple of weeks ago, or 3 or 4 weeks ago, was in Ankara for talks. And a lot of us looked at that and surmised that something was happening, but we couldn't quite put our fingers on it. This was a grandiose plan that was hatched in order to decapitate everybody's enemy. Who's everybody's enemy? Iran, its proxies, Hezbollah, the Shiites. And so you have the Sunni Muslim leader of the Sunni Muslim world, de facto, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, Erdogan, who has sat down now with his Israeli counterparts, and the Israelis want this thing called Greater Israel. And he's taken the position, that's fine. You can have Greater Israel. This is what we want. Now, I don't know where that line of demarcation between where Turkish power and influence ends and where Israeli power and influence begins. But I can tell you that the effects of the Islamists and Mr. Erdogan, who's backing them, are being felt now in Jordan and all the way to Egypt. And they're starting to make their presence felt down in Iraq. And I think the people in the Emirates are also watching, as are the Saudis. They are not necessarily cheering, and they certainly aren't anxious to rush over into the arms of Israel or Turkey at this stage. But I think what we're looking at is essentially two men with two, at least at the moment, complementary visions strategically of what each wants in the region. We support one of them. We don't necessarily support Erdogan, but we're helpful to him insofar as he serves our purposes. And right now, since he's anti-Iranian, anti-Shiite, and willing to do business with Israel, we're willing to do business with him. The question is, how long does this last?
And one of the other questions, especially when Trump enters office here, is what to do about the U.S. troops in Syria, in the area where the Syrian Democratic Forces, and what does he do with the Syrian Democratic Forces themselves? Does he just abandon them? Does he say, y'all just got to make your own deals? How does Trump manage that? Because there's some feedback, fallback, pushback that could come as a result of that because of how long we've been there. Though
sure.
You and I have been arguing they should leave for a long time ago, but that's what he's going to have to face. How is that going to work out?
Well, the Kurds, of course, if you look at the map, and it's largely accurate, it's usually in yellow. I can't really see the map that you're showing, or maybe it's green now. I don't know which it is. But the point is that the western, southwestern, northeastern, southeastern and northeastern portions of Syria are largely under the control of Kurdish fighters, Kurdish independence fighters. They were anti-Islamist and did cooperate on a limited basis with Assad when it was in their interest to do so because they didn't want to fall under Turkish hegemony. Well, now that's gone. Assad is gone. The forces that he commanded are gone. And what they have on their flanks are Islamists, Sunni Islamists, Arabs, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Kazakhs, and so forth, professional jihadists. And they have the Turkish military. And if there's one thing that President Erdogan would like to do, and I think most Turks would like to see, is the Kurdish threat to Turkey eliminated. And as long as you have what effectively amounts to an independent or autonomous Kurdish state, this is something that the Turks cannot possibly tolerate over the long run. Now, that means that the Iranians, and some of the Kurds are Shiites, the Iranians will undoubtedly offer support to the Kurds at this stage of the game. Whether or not that will help much is unclear. We'll be in a difficult position because we have told the Kurds that we're going to support them. And we have, but it may turn out to be in our interest to leave, in which case we're turning them over and the region over to the Turks. This is the kind of thing that we don't really understand. And right now, and I just want to throw this out so people are aware of it, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Azerbaijan and the Turks, the Azeri Turks in Azerbaijan, are virtually identical with the Turks that live in Anatolia, are looking at seizing the corridor that is controlled by Armenia right now that links Azerbaijan with Turkey. Mr. Erdogan refers to Azerbaijan and Turkey as two states in one nation. Azerbaijan is very close and has done a lot of work with the Israelis. The Israelis have supported them in their war against the Armenian Christians. And I suspect that in any real knockdown, drag-out war with Iran, that the Israelis will utilize the bases and locations inside Azerbaijan to ensure that there is a strong second front against Iran, or in Azerbaijan against Iran. So this is rapidly spreading and becoming finally a truly regional war, but it's still on the escalatory ladder. It's at the low end right now, but it could rise very, very quickly, almost overnight. And the Israelis are now eyeing Damascus. That too was identified as part of the Greater Israel Project.
Yeah, that's actually where I wanted to go next. In fact, the news this morning is that Israel has been on its massive bombing campaign, wiping out the Syrian Navy and wiping out a lot of their military bases, their armament capabilities, tanks, artillery pieces, ammunition storage warehouses. Literally, they're just taking out everything militarily. While, if you can throw that other map up there, while they're starting to move beyond the Golan Heights and as you say, in the direction of Damascus, it's unclear right now. And the Israelis have said nothing about what their territorial ambitions are, but how far do you think they could go in there? And is there a risk for them overextending and having too much of an appetite?
Well, if you look at Damascus, its location, it's actually quite close to the Israeli border. You can drive to Damascus on a good road in an hour, maybe a little more, but not much. So reaching Damascus quickly is not difficult. There's also not much between the Israeli border and Damascus. There are some villages, but they're very small, inconsequential. And from the Israeli standpoint, you could brush them off like you would fleas. The problem is that Damascus, like Jerusalem, is another great city in the Muslim world. These are places that are part of Islamic civilization, just as Baghdad was, so is Damascus, Cairo, and of course, Jerusalem. So I don't know what kind of effect that would have. That's a question you'll have to ask Mr. Netanyahu. I'm sure he would love to take Damascus and hold it, but would that suddenly interrupt his good relations with the Turks? I suspect it probably would. So it's hard to tell. But the point is that the Greater Israel Project that I would argue just a couple of weeks ago was DOA has now had real life breathed into it by the collapse of the Assad regime. And remember, we have puppets in Cairo and we have a puppet in Jordan. These puppets are paid off handsomely, and they are obedient to our will with regard to Israel. Now, Sisi is an amazing man. I'm surprised he's still alive because his population wants to go to war. I'm sure he has good security, and he's probably killed everybody that could possibly compete with him. But I wouldn't rule out that he could suddenly vanish from the screen if he continues on the same path, because right now he is purely a U.S.-Israeli puppet. Abdullah is in a different position. He's hostage to the Israelis for water for his country. The Israelis can cut off the water, and suddenly millions of people are going to die of thirst in Jordan, frankly. So I think Jordan is going to remain in this uneasy position, but the Islamists don't care about those things. And the Islamists will penetrate that Jordanian border as though there's nothing there. And once they move into that area, you could see chaos in Jordan as well. The point is that Israel has to be careful because what they think they can take and digest could, as you point out, be too much at this stage. And they could end up with more trouble on their flanks than they think. Remember that Hamas is not dead. It's been severely wounded, but it's not dead. And they have not succeeded in killing or driving out all of the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza. And they still want to do the same thing to the people living on the West Bank.
Right.
Because you only have so many forces, you can only stretch them so far. But the assumption has always been that people in the Middle East can be bribed, bullied, or bombed into submission. Well, I think the bribing and the bullying has reached almost its limits, and the bombing now has a serious effect, but I don't think the effect is going to be quite what it's been in the past. You're running out of really weak opponents and adversaries. You're going to start seeing some real resistance. And I'm talking primarily about the Iranians, their proxies in Iraq, as well as Kurdish elements and the Turks. These are serious people. They'll fight. It could get very, very bloody. Now, again, from an Israeli standpoint, they always look at their neighbors and celebrate whenever they kill each other. But the question is, what happens when that stops? Yeah. What happens when some new modus vivendi is reached? Do the Turks suddenly turn their gaze further to the west and look at Israel? There's nothing that would make Erdogan happier than to present himself as the savior of Islam and the liberator of the Islamic holy sites in Jerusalem.
Well, we'll certainly have to wait and see how that happens. I pray that it never comes to fruition. That just remains a distant aspiration. In the last few minutes we have here, though, I want to look at U.S. interests in particular. One of the things I've been arguing since really the first Trump administration all the way through has been our troops in Syria and Iraq especially are nothing but points of vulnerability, and we need to withdraw them all. But apparently that's not the view of the elite foreign policy, so-called, in the United States. And the outgoing administration seems to want to put a card on the ground here to say, hey, incoming administration, keep your hands off the troops there because they're desperately needed. Here's what Jake Sullivan said in trying to make the case to keep the troops there.
We have a presence both in Iraq and in Syria. That presence in Syria is there to work hand in hand with local partners to continue to suppress the threat that ISIS has posed going back many years now. And we've had significant progress in that fight just even in the last few months. Major players taken off the battlefield, large-scale degradation of those ISIS forces. But of course, an event like this happens, and ISIS immediately looks to take advantage. And we have seen reports of ISIS trying out in the Syrian Badia, the desert, to try to reconstitute to a certain extent. So we will continue to take action against that. And we will continue to make sure that force protection, the protection of our service members who are serving at a range of bases in eastern Syria, is the paramount concern from the president on down. The threat to those service members is not just from ISIS or from this violence. It is also from Iranian-backed Shia militia groups who themselves could try to take advantage of this. And so we are also doing what we believe we need to do to prepare for, deter, and protect against any potential attacks from that group of actors, which of course we have seen over the course of the past few years, and which we under the Biden administration have responded to at several points with direct strikes against those forces, both in Syria and in Iraq.
He makes the case that those troops there actually have combat power and that they can be used to defend American interests if they needed to be. But we're talking about roughly 2,500 in Iraq and 900 in all that vast expanse of Syria that you talked about a minute ago, and they're not doing anything there. So why do we want to keep those troops in there, and what do you think Trump will do about it?
Well, he was, let us say, just to be polite, rather disingenuous about a number of things. First of all, we, that is the CIA, and I think MI6 from Britain, have had a hand in rebranding ISIS and all of these radical Islamists and making them into something else, at least on the surface, so that they could be utilized to attack the enemies that we have chosen. And those enemies are Iran and its Shiite supporters. So insofar as we've had a hand in that, I think it's a little ridiculous for him to say, well, we're keeping an eye on this because ISIS will take advantage of it. ISIS is there. ISIS is us, okay? And ISIS does have their eyes on Tikrit, on Mosul, on Kirkuk in northern Iraq, which, of course, are cities of great interest to the Turks, who view those cities as Turkish anyway. So if anything, what we've done now is we put the Kurds in this unenviable position of becoming a target for the Turkish military in the near future. The Turks now have the opportunity to flank and surround the Kurds down in Syria and drive headlong into them and throw them out of Syria entirely. And I think these are things that are being considered. As I said, on Turkish television, you see all these depictions of Greater Turkey, or, you know, the neo-Ottoman Turkish sphere of influence. All of it's readily available. I also disagree with him in terms of his strategic interests. We have always had an interest basically in two things. We have an interest in the flow of oil, maintaining the commercial access for ourselves and everybody else in the region, and in the preservation of Israel as a state. We have essentially said that's our national interest, which is one of the reasons I and several others were very critical of this terrible campaign in Gaza, because I don't think that's the way for Israel to survive. I think it's a way for Israel to go in the opposite direction, because no one in the region has forgotten that. Everyone in the region knows that they are, in the Israeli eyes, Amalek and subhuman. That's not a mystery. That's not gone away, and that's going to plague Israel as long as it exists. So I have a disagreement with what's strategically important. We need good relations with the Emirates, with Saudi Arabia, the various other players in the oil business. We want to keep that flowing, and we want to see Israel survive. The rest of this that he's talking about is nonsense. So I agree with you. I think at some point we're in a very difficult position. And that is probably going to be once the Turks have consolidated power and influence in Syria and begun to expand it into Iraq and Jordan. And those things are underway. It's going to take time. Same thing is true to a lesser extent for the Israelis. They've got to consolidate and control whatever they take over. That may not be easy. They may think so at this point, but it may not be. And again, the further you move away from your, let us say, your logistical supply points or your base, the more vulnerable you become. And moving all the way to Damascus may be very appealing and be greeted with cheers in Israel, but it creates new vulnerabilities. It raises new questions, and it potentially damages Israel's relations with others, particularly Turkey.
And in the last few minutes here, what is the risk for the United States if we don't withdraw those troops out of Syria? And they're there allegedly to help, to work hand in glove with the Syrian Democratic Forces, and the Turkish forces start moving out. We could be put in the position to where we may have to decide either to abandon the Syrian Democratic Forces or to actually fight the Turkish forces. What risk is there of that?
Well, I think the risk is very high, and I would dump all these terms that talk about democracy. That's all nonsense. There's no democracy anywhere. We ought to just forget it. The Turks want to rid themselves of the Kurdish problem. That's an inevitability. We're sitting there tied to the Kurds. So answer your own question. At some point, that becomes very dangerous for us. And if you expect the Israelis to intervene to save the Kurds or save us, you're out of your mind. That's not even up for discussion. They're going to sit on what they've got and what they think they can hold in the context of greater Israel. So they're not going to do anything. So we're on our own. And I agree with you. I've never liked these penny packets of U.S. soldiers on the ground. I don't care how many mercenaries are with them. I don't care how many intelligence officials are out there. It's very dangerous. And I think it could blow up in our faces. Not immediately, but over time. And again, who anticipated what we saw happen in Syria? Maybe somebody in the intelligence community knew about it. Certainly in the CIA, they knew this is what they were working for, but nobody was going to warn anyone or tell anything about anything because we wanted this to happen. Well, it's happened. We've created this new whirlwind. The question is, do we escape from it, or are we going to be consumed by it? It's too soon to tell. And the same question has to be answered by the Israelis.
Indeed, it does. And we'll leave it there for now. But we are going to keep a close eye on this and look forward to having you back real soon to talk about whatever happens next as we get closer to that date. So first of all, just thank you for coming back on. We always appreciate you coming here. But before we let you go, actually, wonders, is there anything new in Our Country, Our Choice? What's happening with your organization down there?
Well, I think most of our members are getting ready for Christmas. We're trying to prepare for some things. We're trying to put some shows together for January 2025, and we're continuing to build out and expand this Republic platform. And as I always say, that is the free speech instrument inside the United States from which you can't be censored or thrown off. So whatever you do, get on that platform, because once you join as a member, you have a communications network that is readily made for you and your organization and the people like you that will reach everyone all over the country. In fact, we're seeing more and more people from abroad take an interest in this and try to figure out how they can essentially extend it into their countries, places like Sweden, Germany, Austria, even France, Italy. So we'll see. It's very exciting. And I invite everybody to go to Republic and look it over, see what's there. I think you'll like it. And it's time to get on the ground floor as this thing grows. I only see it growing larger. I don't see anything to hold it back.
Well, that's often. We certainly applaud that and recommend people go and do that. We're actually going to have some materials to be sharing with our folks here. We have a lot of international folks watch this, and the fact that it's not just something for the United States, I think will appeal to a lot of them, and we'll be sharing some of those details in the very near future as well. So thanks for coming on, Doug, and thanks for all this update. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan.
And we appreciate you guys too. Be sure and like and subscribe to our channel if you're new to it. If you haven't been here before, we'd love to have you come back. Also, let you know that at 3 o'clock this afternoon, U.S. Eastern time, Larry Johnson's going to be coming on, and he's going to look at the back at this situation in Syria from a different lens and perspective of, has the U.S. been supporting freedom or sponsoring terrorism in this situation here? The answers may disturb some people, but if you want the truth, turn back in today at 3 p.m., and we'll see you then on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.